Thank you, Gary, very much. Those who've heard some of my previous lectures won't be surprised that I've cut roughly 5,000 words from this, and I suspect probably the 5,000 words that are most important, but they had to have a setting, so you're getting the setting at least. It makes me think that Martin Krieger, who gave a lecture in last year's series, Who's Afraid of International Law, was probably right to say in an essay that he contributed to a feshrift for me that the essay form is not my natural form. The book writing is my more natural form, and what goes for essays probably goes for public lectures. I think I'll have to give the whole business away soon. My concern, two concerns sort of driving this lecture, and I'm not sure that I can bring them to a meeting point where they're sort of mutually intelligible to one another. One comes from political events at the end of last year and early this year in Britain, where I used to spend half the year at King's College London. And of course those events include the release of Wikileaks documents and the arrest of Julian Assange. The other direction from which my concerns come are long-standing and have to do with the conditions and forms of legitimate and illegitimate persuasion broadly as they occur in the realm of ethics, by which I don't just mean in the realm of morality. The distinction between morality and ethics is an old one. There's no agreed way of drawing it. I've found it useful myself recently to think of the ethical as a realm of value that includes morality and also other values, some of which might conflict with moral value. Betrayal, murder and cruelty, for example, are moral wrongs. If the conception of a moral wrong has any application, it has application to them. But there are people who, for example, think it matters very fundamentally to their sense of their lives, to live their lives with lucidity and with a concern for the past, which is not just explicable in terms of a prudential concern for the future. And there are other people who don't think that at all. They think that the past matters only insofar as it informs prudential considerations for the future. Now, the former of those people might think the latter to be superficial, but they would hardly think them to be immoral, and yet one would naturally describe a concern for truthfulness about one's life, of the kind that Socrates, for example, expressed when he said that the unexamined life is unworthy of a human being. One would naturally think of that as an ethical concern, though not perhaps a moral one. And ever since Socrates, there has been a belief, or perhaps more accurately, a fear, in the West at least, that morality and politics may be in deep and irreconcilable conflict. Not because politics is too disreputable for a morally good person to take part in it, but because at critical points moral and political conduct may belong to incommensurable realms of value, both of which will claim the allegiance of any serious person. So that's a reason for thinking of the ethical as a realm which includes other values, which may be values sui generis, and which may sometimes indeed conflict. Well, last week when I introduced, in fact, in the book that Gary mentioned, After Romulus, which I've just finished writing, I talk about the conflict between a certain conception of romanticism and the way that comes into conflict with moral value. Well, last week when I introduced Guy Rundle, I said that the topic of this year's series emerged from discussion that he and I had in a restaurant in London, Soho, in January of this year. And at the time he was writing on Wikileaks. And given that Julian Assange was breaking news almost every day, you'll understand why I thought that he would be an ideal first speaker. But to tell the truth, Wikileaks was not what mostly was on my mind when I thought of the series. Wikileaks is, of course, of major political significance, indeed one of the major events of our time, probably, and its repercussions, for good and ill, will be felt for a long time. But like many people, I suspect, I had little sympathy for the governments that had been embarrassed and worse by its revelations, leaving aside now the consequences for people whose names were leaked and who might be murdered as a consequence of that leak. Putting that aside at the moment, I had little embarrassment for the governments who were embarrassed by the revelations, because I think, like most people, I thought that secrecy is necessary to government, but so too is trust in government if its claims to secrecy are to be respected. And in Britain and elsewhere, successive governments have for a very long time not deserved the trust of their citizens. But at the time that I had these conversations with Guy in January, British citizens, I thought, were politically disoriented in ways that had less to do with anxiety about whether they could trust their governments to tell the truth or to justifiably withhold secrets from them. And if I were to try to summarise rather generally what kind of disorientation that was, I'd say it was a disorientation caused by their fear that the very conditions of sober judgment, of political sobriety, indeed of political judgment, had become eroded. And if that's the case, then even more than the absence of information, it undermines any possibility of genuine consent. Well, a few days before I met Guy in London, a young student, in fact he was a schoolboy in year 12 or A-levels, was sentenced to 2 years and 8 months imprisonment for throwing a fire extinguisher from the roof of a building that he and other student demonstrators had partially occupied during a demonstration in December. The demonstration had turned violent, as is often the case with these demonstrations. It was hijacked by, amongst others, the Socialist Workers' Party and some other people utterly intent on violence. And some police and many more demonstrators were injured, one in fact rather seriously, requiring emergency brain surgery because he was allegedly beaten by a policeman rather viciously with a truncheon. That boy, by the way, was later charged with violent disorder a few months later. Well, Woolard's sentence, the boy who was sent to prison, Edward Woolard's sentence, which most people regarded as astonishingly severe, even though everybody recognised that if the fire extinguisher had in fact fallen on a person, it might have killed him. Woolard's severe sentence provoked The Guardian to ask in an editorial, what are the limits of legitimate consent? And it is, of course, an old question, familiar to people, certainly to people my age, and as familiar to people of my age as the relatively mild violence of the demonstration in which Woolard took place. Well, the discussion that followed about the Guardian's question, the discussion that followed about the conditions for legitimate dissent, encouraged some people to believe that the student demonstrations expressed a revival of the spirit of political revolt of the 60s and early 70s. The mood of the students in Britain in 2010 and 11, however, could hardly have been more different from the mood of the student of the 60s. There's no doubt that's partly because the students of the 60s had their futures before them and were full of optimism. They had reason to think, justifiable reason to think, that the world was at their feet. But the students in Britain were protesting against a fee hike that for many of them would have raised their fees from £3,000 to £9,000 a year at a time of severe financial crisis when unemployment was a likely prospect for them. But dramatic though that difference is, it still doesn't capture, that difference between the students in Britain in 2010 and 11 and the students of the 60s, here and in Britain and in the States. Dramatic as that difference is, it doesn't capture what I think was most significant in the difference. Many of the students who demonstrated had voted for the Liberal Democrats, who had promised in their election campaign, indeed they made it a central plank of their campaign, that they would not increase fees. Nick Clegg, who became Deputy Prime Minister in the coalition government that formed, had made a particular point of it. And had it not been for the student votes, the Lib Dems would probably not have been in a position to negotiate a position in the government. And the Lib Dems defended their abandonment of their promise on the grounds that it was a necessary feature of coalition politics, that these are the realities of coalition politics. Well, I doubt that many of the students accepted that, but many more of them would have, I think, had not Clegg lectured them sanctimoniously, literally wagging his finger at them for what, as he put it, their juvenile incapacity to appreciate the reality of politics. The student mood of the demonstration was not just anger that the promises had been broken, nor just bitterness at the consequences that for them, in a financial climate that portended a dark future. It was incredulity that Clegg could have lectured them in such a sanctimonious tone, incredulity and justified offence that they had been treated with such contempt. They could scarcely believe that such things were now possible in British politics, hence their incredulity. Well, their incredulity was not limited to students, nor about their treatment. Incredulity became a kind of mood of the nation. A couple of days after Woolard was charged, at a time when the consequences of the financial crisis and the government's severe cuts were brutally felt by the poorer people of the nation, Bob Diamond, the head of Barclays Banks, responded aggressively to the question whether he and other bankers should forgo multi-million-pound bonuses by saying that it was time for the banks to forget about remorse. Remorse was over for the banks. The banks, of course, had never shown anything that looked like remorse or even serious regret. But for Diamond to say it so brazenly and for him not to be rebuked by a Prime Minister who kept telling the nation that we were in the situation of hardship, all of us together, we're in it all together was the slogan of the Conservative and Liberal Party coalition, that made people feel again as though they were in cloud cuckoo land politically. And that, I think, was part of the reason for the violence of the demonstration, leaving aside the Socialist Workers' Party. It was like shaking somebody in an attempt to call them to seriousness. It was an attempt, as it were, to recreate the conditions of a conversation, or at least for genuine negotiation. In fact, a defence of the conditions of democratic politics rather than assault on those conditions. That doesn't mean that the violence was justified. I'm not saying one way or the other here. Someone might think it was never justified to break the law in the way that the violent demonstrators did. But whatever might be said for that, and whatever might be said generally about crimes against property, the breaking of windows and other crimes against property that were committed in that demonstration, in those circumstances, was not intrinsically an undemocratic act. Sadly, the sense of being politically in cloud cuckoo land was not new for the British. In an essay that I wrote, in fact a quarterly essay published here in Australia, I wrote in 2004 when there was much concern in Australia about John Howard's mendacity over the Children Overboard affair and other matters. I contrasted the response of Australian and British electorates to the mendacity of their respective governments. Australians, it seemed to me at the time, were cynical about their politicians, expected them to lie, but were confident that they, that is the citizens, had their feet on the ground and were therefore capable of taking the measure of their politicians. Australians, it seemed to me then, were confident of their capacity for sober political judgment. The British, however, struck me as so disoriented by the sophisticated and eloquent spin of the new Labor government, led then by Tony Blair, that they couldn't any longer see the ground onto which to plant their feet. More serious than systematically misinforming them or withholding information from them, their government had steadily eroded the conditions for political judgment. And in doing so, it not only denied them the evidence with which to assess this or that claim that it made about the conditions of the National Health Service or about Iraq, for that matter, it undermined what's necessary for the sound application of the very concept of evidence. Knowledge and understanding, and therefore all serious political discussion, depends upon the exercise of sound judgment about what counts as evidence, about when authorities can be relied upon, when they've been justifiably discredited, and so on. Lack of judgment makes us vulnerable to gullibility, or perhaps I should say it's an expression. Gullibility is an expression, just an expression of it, to superstition and sometimes to foolish scepticism of the kind shown by some climate change deniers. Scepticism or open-mindedness that is unrestrained by judgment is one side of the coin, whose other side is gullibility. To oversimplify a little, the concept of sound judgment is partly constitutive of the boundaries within which concepts like evidence, common knowledge, common sense, and authority mean what they do to us. And without it, open-mindedness degenerates into the parody of itself. That's the butt of the joke about a man who had a really open mind, open at both ends, that is. It used some people here might remember, it used to be the case in Victorian schools, perhaps schools across the country, that students did in their final year or their penultimate year a subject called clear thinking, in which they were taught, in which they might, for example, take an editorial from a newspaper or a letter from a newspaper and dissect it for the quality of its thought. And they would be taught that this or that is a bad appeal to authority, or this or that is an argument ad hominem, and so on. And if they were lucky, they might even be taught the elementary principles of logic. But though they were taught these things, and though it was very important that they should be taught these things, and I think it's a shame that they're not taught them anymore, still, an education in these things is not the same as an education in judgment. And it's not clear to me that there could be anything called an education in judgment in the way that one might teach, let's say, clear thinking, as it used to be taught. Clearly, judgment is something that's learnt and picked up in all sorts of ways, and it might be an important part of one's education, or one important part of thinking about education, to think about how it might be picked up, but you can't teach it in a way that you can teach someone that this is an argument ad hominem, or this is the way to conduct a valid inference, and so on. And indeed, in courses in reasoning by philosophers, not only is this not taught, but I would actually say, and in fact it had been about 4,000 of the 5,000 words I cut out of this lecture to show that in my discipline, philosophy, not only are these things not taught, but philosophy has probably done more in its conception of what it is to think well and badly to undermine any sensible notion of judgment as it has. Anyway, that would be another argument, but I'd apply that also not just to philosophy generally, but to anything, to most forms of analytical philosophy of law. And sometimes the failure of judgment, the radical absence of judgment in a society can be utterly hair-raising, as Hannah Arendt, for example, made clear in her book on the origins of totalitarianism was the case in Nazi Germany, and Solzhenitsyn made clear in his books on the Gulag archipelago was the case in the Soviet Union, and as was the case in China, when, for example, people would proclaim that having studied up Chairman Mao's account of dialectical reasoning, they had learned how to prevent their bean curds from turning yellow. So we can be, one of the things I would say about, despite some of the pessimistic things I'll be saying tonight, is how lucky we are, in fact, to be discussing the absence of judgment, or the absence of truth-telling, or the unjustifiable holding of secrets, to be discussing that in such a relatively benign political atmosphere as we in fact live in, compared to many of the countries of the world. Well, something interesting about the British disorientation that I've been talking about came out when there was a report released in Britain by a man called Lord Hutton, a report into the death of David Kelly, and a report on whether it was true that Tony Blair's government had, as the phrase put it, sexed up its report on Saddam's alleged weapons of mass destruction. When the report came out, there was a kind of explosion of incredulity that cleared the fog so that the British could finally put their ground, see the ground onto which to put their feet. From left to right, from tabloid to broadsheet newspapers, from Channel 5 to BBC 2, one heard almost unanimously expressions of disbelief that a man could be so foolish as Hutton had been to think that the worst that the government could be accused of was putting the most favourable interpretation on the facts available to it. And the joy that then seemed to sort of take over the nation for at least 2 or 3 days was not that information had been given to them that had been previously withheld and so on. It was the joy that they thought they had re-established, at least temporarily, the conditions of political judgment. Well, the difference between the Australians and Britain, the Brits in this respect, didn't last long, unfortunately. After an election last year in which the leaders of the two main parties expressed unprecedented contempt for the political intelligence of the electorate, things have changed here. You may remember that not long after Kerry O'Brien pressed Julia Gillard on whether she really could not see that she insulted the political intelligence of the electorate by persistently repeating, as he put it, party-generated slogans and cliches, she announced that the real Julia was on her way back, and satirists responded mercifully, and she must have known that they would. What's interesting is to ask, why did Gillard think that the question about the authenticity of a politician's identity should in any but exceptional circumstances be relevant to what citizens have a right to expect of them, to the ways they're answerable to the citizens they govern or hope to govern? Well, my guess is that part of the answer is to be found in the fact that she was responding to discontent with the product of party spin. And spin, I suspect she realised, as Tony Abbott didn't and still, I think, does not, is a distinctive form of political mendacity, quite different from lying and other more common ways that politicians deny citizens truthful answers to their questions. And spin is, when it becomes protracted enough and sophisticated enough, as it did in Britain, can cause, as I said, an erosion of the very conditions of political sobriety. Well, earlier I said that my thoughts in this lecture were really coming from two different directions. One was the political events that I've just been describing, but another was a concern, a long-standing concern about what it is to be persuaded legitimately rather than illegitimately. And it was Socrates who first pressed that distinction, and in doing so gave us a way of thinking about why it matters in personal and public life that the reasons we think we believe something actually are the reasons that we believe it, why that should matter. So after the dispiriting things that I've been talking about, I'll indulge for a little bit the pleasure for me of talking about Socrates. In this case, the character in Plato's dialogues rather than the historical character, because it's the character in the dialogues that's really haunted Western political imagination. And I'll concentrate on what he has to say, but as importantly on what his practice shows about the nature of conversation in Plato's great and enduringly relevant dialogue Gorgias, that was named after one of the great orators of the time. The dialogue is better known for being the one in which Socrates claims to his incredulous interlocutors that it's better to suffer evil than to do it. But in the first section of the dialogue, Socrates distinguishes philosophy from oratory when he says to Polus, one of Gorgias's young disciples, that while he, Polus, is good at oratory, he is really bad at conversation. And for our purposes, we can read Spin for oratory. And of course, as you know, for Socrates, philosophy was not the relatively specialised academic pursuit it has now become. It was a search inspired by a love of wisdom. And to avoid some of the old fogish connotations that have accrued to the word wisdom, I'll speak instead, taking myself to be true to Socrates' intent, of a search inspired by a need of lucidity about what matters most to us in life, about what Socrates put it, how to live. Well, most of Plato's philosophical writings are called dialogues because Socrates almost always engaged only one person at a time in philosophical conversation. He insisted always that they speak for themselves, say what they believe rather than what they'd heard said, or what one might say for the sake of an argument, or what they might say were they to play devil's advocate, or what they might believe that any rational being whatsoever might feel herself compelled to say. But he didn't just want them to say what they mean and mean what they say. He hoped that in this practice they would come to learn what that came to, what in the course of conversation that really came to. Nor did he want them merely to be sincere in the profession of what they believed, because he knew, of course, that sincerity can be a shallow thing, that people can be sentimental about their sincerity and its significance. We can say something which is sincerely expressive of our beliefs, but it be nonetheless mere words. Instead, Socrates called those to whom he spoke to a kind of seriousness, a call to which they could respond only if they spoke in an effort of disciplined lucidity out of what they had reflectively made of themselves in their lives. Come now, do you mean this? Do you take me for a fool? Think, why do you so constantly resort to cliché? Why do you yield so often to your sentimentality? And so on. Socratic calls to seriousness could be severe, and they can be both morally and intellectually severe. Conversation, however, of the kind that we praise when we sometimes say, oh, at last someone to talk to, someone really to talk to, demands truthfulness, not just in the sense of honesty, but also in the sense that implies a serious effort to try to see things as they are, rather than as they appear to us because we're sentimental or spiritually weary, or just plain morally and intellectually lazy, when we yield to an almost infinite many distortions of reality that we fabricate in obedience to what Iris Murdoch called the fat, relentless ego. Why, after all, would we be joyful that at last we had someone really to talk to, unless we trusted that person to be severe with us? And were I to develop this, I try to show that, contrary to Richard Rorty, there's no plausible account of why conversation matters to us, as it did to Socrates, that's consistent with scepticism about whether it requires a robust conception of truth. Well, Socrates, you'll recall, said to Polus that Polus was good at oratory but bad at conversation. And to explain why, he elaborates on his famous distinction between knowledge and true belief. The details of that distinction are controversial, but one can perhaps express the basic idea this way. When a person believes something, doesn't matter what, she also believes that her belief is true. And sometimes we express indeed our uncertainty about something by saying that we merely believe it, that we're not sure, that we could be wrong. But characteristically, belief is contrasted with doubt, and everybody recognises the conceptual strangeness of saying that one believes such and such, but it's not true. In addition to believing one's beliefs to be true, one also believes, and this is part of the concept of belief and not a generalisation about human beings, one believes oneself to be rightly related to what makes it true. It's proved notoriously difficult in philosophy to explain positively what counts as the right relation to what makes one's beliefs true, but there is such a relationship and must be if there's to be such a thing at all as belief. And that appears to be shown by the fact that there are clearly wrong ways of coming to belief, even a true belief. Being indoctrinated is an obvious example. Being lied to is another. More subtle forms of what used to be called false consciousness, another example. Wishing to believe something merely because one wants to, because, for example, it's too painful to believe otherwise, is yet another. Being seduced by flattery, yet another. If we come to realise that we believe something only because we want to, or because we've been indoctrinated or lied to, or because our sentimentality has been exploited, we can no longer rationally hold on to that belief. Of course, desire or indoctrination may be so strong, or sentimentality may go so deep in us that it's difficult to give up the belief, even though we know in our hearts that we hold it for reasons that have nothing to do with its truth. But in the absence of such psychological factors, a belief which we acknowledge to hold for those reasons, and only for those reasons, would simply be extinguished by that acknowledgement. And we can perhaps now see why Socrates said to Polus that he, Polus, was good at oratory, but not at all good at conversation. He meant that conversation respected our need to be rightly related to our beliefs, to what makes them true. Oratory, and again, read spin here, oratory abused and exploited that need. A good orator must always indeed generate the illusion in his audience that they've been rightly persuaded, that they're rightly related to whatever makes their beliefs true. Included in this, of course, is to generate the illusion of conversational intimacy. And his capacity to do that will be the central element of his skill. And in that way, orators manipulate people to believe whatever they want them to suit their purposes. And when they do this, they abuse in a very fundamental way a trust that is implicit in anything that seriously can be called conversation. Namely, the trust that the person with whom one is conversing will respect one's need to be persuaded legitimately rather than illegitimately. And conversation, as Socrates rightly thought of it, requires renunciation of the power we often have to convince our partners in conversation by illegitimate means, to convince them in ways which they could not possibly seriously consent to. Paradoxically, it's both hard to exaggerate and perhaps because we're so used to it now, hard to convey how precious is this renunciation, this respectful kind of trust that's essential to the very possibility of conversation. It marks the way that others are distinctive kinds of limits to one's will. When Polus boasts shamelessly of the power he believes that oratory has given him, Socrates said, "You've forgotten your geometry, Polus." And at first this sounds a very strange thing to say, but when we realise that he intends to bring Polus to the realisation that he fails to acknowledge limits other than those of power, physical or psychological power, then we can see perhaps why he said it. Polus acknowledges, of course, that there are personalities that are so powerful that they're well beyond the powers of his persuasion, no matter how hard he tries. He'll then acknowledge that he can't persuade them, no matter how hard he tries. And that's to recognise one kind of limit to the will. But Socrates convinced But Socrates convinced him, convinced him to be genuinely open to the nature of conversation, then Polus would realise that though he has the power to convince his partner in conversation by, for example, manipulating his vulnerability to pathos or his fear of facing a painful truth, he cannot do it. And that recognition that he can't do it is a recognition of an entirely different kind of limit, a kind of limit we call ethical. He must then, in order to be true to the trust his partner places in him, renounce the power that he has. And that shows itself in the fact that in the first case, where Polus strikes an overwhelmingly strong personality, it makes sense to say, look, if you try by deploying this technique, or even if you just try harder, you'll succeed. But to say that in the second case, where he recognises an ethical impossibility in what he does, it would betray a failure to understand the kind of limit that Polus would acknowledge. And conversation, this is fundamental to it, presupposes acknowledgement of that kind of limit. But it's ironic that just now, when the electorate seems more estranged from politics than ever before, politics has become more personal and more intimate. Politicians appear regularly with their families and are seen on television and heard on the radio, and more they make use of the apparent conversational intimacy of talkback radio. John Howard used to be a master of this kind of intimacy. Mostly it's a con, of course, because, as Socrates pointed out, politicians trained in oratory will pretend to a conversational intimacy to obtain a trust that they will then betray, because their purpose is to secure support with little regard for whether they've legitimately persuaded the person or not. Necessarily, therefore, they can't be responsive to calls to seriousness, to calls whose potential is fundamental to the possibility of genuine conversation. The bitter political tone of the Gorgas has often been noticed, and that tone comes from its author, Plato, who was commenting on Socrates' failure. And that failure, Plato tells us, shows the radical incompatibility between conversation and politics. Taken seriously as it should be, that bitterness is a sobering antidote to the fashionable appeal to conversation in politics. Nonetheless, I believe, I hope, that Plato was wrong. It would, of course, be foolish to believe that the kind of answerability to another person's call to seriousness and the kind of individuality that's required to rise to it could be fully realised in the relations between politicians and citizens, no matter how well things go on talkback radio. Real conversation is difficult in most circumstances, and were it not so, we would not be struck by the exclamation, "At last, someone to talk to, really to talk to." Nonetheless, when the notion of conversation is used explicitly or implicitly in the practice of politics, we, that is politicians and citizens, are reminded that citizens are individuals, answerable to one another, answerable to politicians, and the politicians are in turn answerable to them. It's not, I think, fanciful to say that a politician explicitly on talkback radio, but also implicitly in the manner of her speech on television, can enter into a relationship with citizens where she's answerable to the challenge. Come, are you serious? Do you expect me really to believe that? Do you take me for a fool? And so on. And such calls to seriousness cover the various forms of mendaciousness. They demand not only that one does not tell a lie, but also that one does not lie to another by lying to oneself. They demand that one stop evading the issue, that one stop muddying the waters. Bringing democratic politics under the constraints of conversation is a way of dramatising the ideal of a democracy as a form of government in which politicians must argue their cause and legitimately persuade the electorate, answerable to it not as to a mass, but as to individuals whose need of truth they must not betray. The solemnity of the requirements that politicians don't mislead the representatives of the people in Parliament is an example of this. And only in very exceptional circumstances is trust not betrayed, when repeatedly we get spin and obfuscation in response to the serious plea that we be told the truth on matters of importance. Gorgias argued to Socrates, the orator Gorgias in the character in the dialogue, argued to Socrates that oratory was a morally neutral skill used by good people for good ends and bad people for bad ones. Socrates argued in return that it was rotten through and through, because always, even when the orator speaks the truth, in the name of a good cause, he cares not a fig for it or the need of it on the part of those he is manipulating. Necessarily he betrays the trust that we put in others, that when they convince us, they have taken us to a place where they have not undermined our hope that we believe things for the right reasons. But Plato argues, and this is one of his deepest insights in Gorgias, that it's a mistake to believe that the more skillful an orator is in his use of manipulative techniques, the more in control he is. When a person is no longer seriously answerable to a call to seriousness, to the demand that he speak truthfully for himself, to reveal that distinctive perspective he has on the world, then after a time his self is gradually but certainly eroded. And the point is not the narrowly moral one, that a spin doctor has abandoned moral values. It is that he's lost that in himself which he needs to rise to their demands, or to the demands intrinsic to calls to seriousness, and thereby lost the capacity for sobriety, for sober judgment, without which one cannot really have a grip on oneself and who one is. And that suggests an answer to the question I posed earlier. Why did Julia Gillard think that questions about the authenticity of a politician's identity should, in any but exceptional circumstances, be relevant to what citizens have a right to expect of them? Well, I've connected calls to seriousness. Oh, sorry, I'm getting on a bit, I'll skip this. The burden of what I've been saying is that we need to see the concerns that we have for truthfulness in politics, for free speech, concerns over secrecy and so on, and concerns even over violent demonstrations, in a wider context of a kind of bewilderment, of a disorientation caused by the absence of the conditions of sober judgment. But there's another cause, and I'm not quite sure how it should be connected to the matter of judgment, but it is itself also one of the things that undermines the possibility of a call to seriousness that is essential to sober judgment. And it's pervaded many institutions, from the civil service to university, and it's what I and others have called managerial newspeak. It involves the redescription of the activities of an institution in ways congenial to their management by people who have no inwardness with those activities at all, but who can manage just because they redescribe things in terms congenial to management, can manage them and manage them in other institutions as well. And because this is a public lecture in a university, I'll take the universities as my example. The concept, in fact, of a university, as it used to be when people talked about the idea of a university, or when they said things like you can't have a university without a classics department or without a philosophy department and so on, is now quite clearly defunct. No institutions that are called universities, from the most to the least academically distinguished, think seriously of what they do under the concept of a university. No academic managers, I'm sure, feel the need to consider whether the courses they would introduce or acts in the university are consistent with a serious conception of a university. And that's partly why they are now called managers, whereas before they were called vice-chancellors, deans, heads of departments, and so on. Managerial newspeak, as I'm calling it, and others have called it, because of the deceit and self-deception that accompanied the profound changes that presupposed that universities could be described without serious distortion in ways that would enable them to be efficiently managed, as well by people who have no understanding of the life of the mind, as by those who have a rich understanding of it. And foolishly, many academics went along with that newspeak, believing that they could forever keep an ironic distance from the descriptions, for example, of heads of departments as unit managers and their students as customers. It was evident, however, even in the 80s, that universities could more easily survive government cuts than they could survive the degraded language in which academics spoke of what they were doing. And it's no small matter, this ubiquitous success of managerial newspeak in the characterisation of university life. Students who learn to speak it, knowing no other language with which to understand themselves, to understand what it can mean to be a student in a university, will not have the words with which to identify the deepest values of their education, and so will not have the words to claim their inheritance. Does it matter, you might say, that the concept of university that licensed tautologies such as you can't have a university without a flourishing school of humanities, does it matter that that's become defunct? Can we not retrieve what was valuable in it without appeal to that concept? Instead of asking what's the essence or the nature of a university, should we not ask instead what are the finest values that have emerged from our traditions of university education? Are there treasures we're obliged to bequeath to future generations? If there are, can we find words that will name them and reveal their value? Which practices will nourish them? And so on. Well, it's true, and I believe it can't be emphasised too strongly, that academics have treasures to bequeath to their students, now as much as when the concept of university meant something. But one of the treasures of the university was the community of scholars, men and women, whose sense of what it was to live the life of the mind in a community that was significant part shaped by the reflection of what it meant for them to be in a university. Historically, much reflection about what it is to live an academic life has been interdependent with thought about the nature of the university as a distinctive institution of higher education. Academics have often been lampooned, and often they've deserved it, and worse, but the academic form of the life of the mind, the living of that life in a university, has itself been one of the treasures of the university, and therefore, I believe, of our culture. The English philosopher Michael Dunnett asked recently whether if philosophy had developed only recently, we would ever have thought that no institution could justifiably call itself a university if it did not nourish a flourishing department of philosophy. And he might have asked that same question about most of the disciplines in a university, and the answer would have been the same. We would not have thought that they were necessary to a serious understanding of what it is for an institution to be a university. But the best thinking about the university was not about a Platonic form of the university. It was thinking that was inward with the distinctive form of the life of the mind that universities nourished. Thought in dialogue with a history of reflection that goes back at least to Socrates. And that historical depth, rather than any idea of a metaphysical essence or a nostalgic allegiance to an historical paradigm, ensured fertile reflection upon the concept of a university and on one historically contingent form of the life of the mind, the academic form. And it's also secured for the concept, or did secure for that concept, some distance from times and places to make it possible for thinkers to judge, whether rightly or wrongly, it doesn't matter, to my point, that their desires, their purposes, their aspirations, and even the spirit of the times were faithful or faithless to the idea of a university, which, though expressed in the singular, was of course never just one thing. And that kind of thought is thought of a kind that can deepen without limit and can never be exhausted by a set of definitions. It requires inwardness with values that are slowly apprehended through living the life of the mind in community with fine exemplars of it, and it can awaken desires we had never had in response to values that we had never before seen. Its dialogical enactment constituted what used to be called a community of scholars, with all the unworldly connotations that expression rightly evokes. And none of that can be captured in anything so simple-minded as the question, and it's the only question that occurs to bureaucrats, what's the purpose of university? Well, that will sound strange to you, I know, because some people think that by definition an institution is defined by its purposes, and if only we can get that clear about that, we'll understand what to do. But I can elaborate on in discussion if need be. Well, because the institutions that we call universities are in complex ways socially and historically embedded, it would be foolish to suggest that one could adequately characterise how they are and how they have come to be that way solely by a philosophical elaboration of the decline of an idea. And it would be equally foolish, however, to think that one could characterise the plight of universities, let alone understand it, without understanding the values that distinguished universities from other institutions of higher education and that determine the character of the disciplines within it. And that means that we can't characterise or explain the plight of universities without understanding, amongst other things, but crucially, how they've come to be dominated by largely instrumental conceptions of their nature. And whatever understanding we achieve about that will in considerable part be the work of history and social theory. But the offering of those disciplines will not take us far unless they're informed by an imaginative conceptual grasp of what that instrumental ideal has replaced. And that will in its turn depend on an inwardness with a life of the mind lived in pursuit of an understanding for its own sake, an inwardness that requires sympathy for the joys and obligations of that life. I hope it goes without saying that such inwardness is not available to those who speak managerial newspeak and those who've been estranged by it from deeper ways of describing what they do that would enable them to express a sense of collegiality, for example, or to speak more deeply of what one does that can be captured by speaking of a job or a career, for example. Estranged by managerial newspeak from ways of speaking, but hearing echoes of it constantly, of the old ideas of the university, if only in what they read, academics are, I think, disoriented, ill at ease with the way they speak of what they do. And it's one of the reasons, I think, why universities have become relatively servile institutions, why nobody anymore expects any seriously radical critique from them. It's hard for academics to think of what they do as something deeper than a job or a career because, as I said earlier, managerial newspeak has estranged them from the deepest ways of speaking of what they do, from the language in which they could describe the life of the mind as something that could be chosen by somebody who had more than mediocre aspirations in their life. And that being so, it's hard for them to grasp that when it comes to risking one's job, because one feels an obligation to stand up for something or to refuse to do something in university, it's hard for them to realise when they feel that obligation that the nature of that obligation is any different from what it might be for a plumber. It's hard for them to realise that it's part of their job description, so to speak, to stand for the integrity of their discipline and, if necessary, against the institution that refuses to nourish that. And what that means then, if I'm right, is that it's not so much it's not cowardice on the part of individual academics that has made universities the relatively servile institutions that they are. Because after all, if you don't see much value in what you're doing, or if you can't, to be more accurate, find ways of describing to yourself even the deepest value of what you're doing, you're not going to risk life and limb for it. Accusations of cowardice are defeated always by a sincere and justified response that such and such is not worth the risk. And what I've been saying about universities, I think, is true for many of the major institutions in our society, of a more directly political sort, like the civil service, and of course in politics itself, which is why I think, in the absence of a language that could sustain a serious conception of political honour, politicians will characteristically brazen out accusation of serious incompetence, or worse, even claiming self-righteously that they must stay in the job to clean up the mess that they've made. What, do you think I'm going to shirk my responsibilities, they say. And one could go on in this way to describe the many ways in which institutions and the members of them no longer feel confident of the ground on which to call one another to account in ways that I've been calling a call to seriousness. Now, I've referred very often in what I've been saying to the ways that we speak, of the language that's available to us, of ways of speaking that can go dead on us, as has, for example, ways of speaking of the university, or ways of speaking about honour in politics. And the question really is how to find one's way, for example, from a language in which one speaks of government as essentially managing a large enterprise, when people talk of running the country, to a way of speaking about politics that can restore to us what most of us are longing for, which is a sense of the dignity of a political vocation. It seems to me that if the values that we hanker for, the values that we long for, as now everybody does when we long for dignity in politics, even if that value is of the highest kind, even if we think that finding a place for it in our lives, personal or politically, would immeasurably deepen our political or personal lives, we may nonetheless be unable to find a place for it in our living speech. And why this should be so is, I think, one of the deepest problems in the epistemology of value, but I think it is so, and it marks one of the fundamental differences between judgments of value and our ordinary paradigms of true and false beliefs, according to which a truth acknowledged is a truth possessed. But an appreciation of the grammar and even of the beauty of a dead form of speech can't make that speech living for us. And our task, I think, is to see how much of the intimations and depth in our rhetoric of the intrinsic value of the scholarly and intellectual life, for example, or of the dignity of politics conceived as a vocation, is honestly and lucidly accessible to us in living and authoritative speech. And it's tempting to represent that as a task to discover what, at bottom, we really believe, or what we can honestly and consistently believe after we've examined the conflicting intimations of our ways of speaking. But discovering whether we can strike a non-rhetorical note in our talk about these matters is not a matter of discovering whether we believe, for example, that the concept of honour should have a serious application in political life. It's more like coming to see which of the concepts that make logical or grammatical sense to us are still available to us, and that discovery and striking the right note are interdependent.